The first thing he felt was the cold. Not the winter cold from outside, but the kind that comes from within, as if his bones were frozen through and his skin didn't know it yet. His forehead pressed against something hard. Wood. Old, smooth wood that smelled of wax and dust. He tried to lift his head, and the world swayed so sharply that his stomach lurched up into his throat. His hands. He looked at his hands. Slender. Pale. With calluses on his middle fingers from a quill. These weren't his hands. Daniel Headmark opened his eyes in a stranger's body and spent the first 3 seconds simply breathing. Unrolled scrolls lay before him. Yellow paper with brown seals. Numbers. Lots of numbers. 120,000 kroner owed to the crown. 80,000 to 5 merchant houses. And one more sum at the very bottom, which someone had crossed out so fiercely that the pen had torn the paper. The candle on the table was burning down. Wax dripped onto the edge of the candlestick and solidified into murky droplets. Snow was falling outside the window. The 3rd day in a row, if he was to believe the stranger's memory that was pouring into his head in jagged fragments. A name. A title. His mother's face. His father's funeral. The smell of wet earth on the coffin lid. And fear. The constant, gnawing fear of an 18-year-old boy left alone to face a mountain of debt in a frozen castle in the middle of a ravaged province. Daniel clenched the stranger's fingers into a fist. He unclenched them. He clenched them again. His muscles obeyed. His body was weak, but alive. He stood up. His legs buckled and he grabbed the edge of the table. He steadied himself. He walked over to the window and looked down. 3 bonfires were burning in the castle courtyard. People were sitting around them. Many people. 200 or more. Women were wrapping children in rags. Old people were warming their hands over the fire. One man lay right on the ground, motionless. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe not anymore. Refugees. The word came from someone else's memory and, at the same time, from his own. He had seen courtyards like this before. Not here. In another life. In another body. Under another sky. But the people's eyes were the same. Empty. Waiting. Prepared for the worst, and believing in nothing good. He turned away from the window. Sat back down at the table. Picked up a pen. It lay in his hand as naturally as if this body had done it 1,000 times. He looked at the debt notes and began to count. Not the debt, not interest. He was counting people. 200 refugees in the courtyard. 3,200 residents in the province, according to the latest census conducted by his father. How many of them could work? How many children? How many elderly? How many sick? His mind worked clearly. The fear of this foreign body receded. The mode he knew from his past life kicked in. The mode for the first few days in a disaster zone. Don't panic. Don't feel sorry. Count. First, food, right now. Second, water, clean water. Third, warmth. Everything else later. At that moment, something opened up over his heart. It didn't hurt. It wasn't loud. As if someone had very quietly unfurled a glass scroll right in the air in front of his chest. A transparent panel with a soft bluish light. The letters on it were written in a language he didn't know but understood. The well-being system has been activated. Satisfied souls. 0 out of 3,400. Daily allowance. 1 copper penny. He blinked. The panel didn't disappear. He ran his hand through it. His hand passed right through. He looked at the candle, then back at the panel. 0 satisfied souls out of 3,400. 1 copper penny a day. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know where it came from, but he knew one thing. 0 was the most honest number he'd ever been shown. There was a knock at the door. He said, "Come in," and the voice was unfamiliar, young, high-pitched. A man of about 60 entered, gray-haired, stooped, with a face that had been old even 20 years ago. Manager Halvar. A stranger's memory suggested the name and title. His father's loyal servant. The last one who hadn't left. Halvar stopped at the door and looked at the young baron the way one looks at a seriously ill person, with a mixture of pity and readiness for the worst. He waited. He expected a tantrum, or an order, or tears, or a question about how much it would cost to sell the castle. Daniel looked him in the eye and asked how much flour was currently in the castle kitchen. Not in the granaries, not in the storerooms, right now, in the kitchen. Halvar was silent for 3 seconds. Then he replied that there were 5 or 6 sacks, maybe 7.
Daniel asked if there was a pot big enough to hold 200 servings of porridge. Halvar said there was a copper washing pot in the old laundry room, a big one. Daniel said, "Bring it to the kitchen, get a fire going, take the flour and cook the porridge, with water, and salt if you have any. 200 servings. Now." Halvar didn't move. He stood there watching. Then he said the Baron should get some rest, that they'd discuss business in the morning, that the refugees would have to wait. Daniel stood up from the table. His body wavered, but he steadied himself. He said there was a man lying in the courtyard who might already be dead, that the children had been sitting in the snow for 3 days, that the porridge had been cooking for 40 minutes and would be ready in an hour. Then he added that this was not a request. Halvar looked at him for a long time. Something had changed in his gaze. Not respect, not yet, but surprise. Genuine, vivid surprise. He nodded and left. Daniel was left alone. He looked at the panel again. 0 satisfied souls. 1 copper penny. He said quietly to himself, "All right, let's start with the porridge." An hour later, he was standing in the castle courtyard next to a copper cauldron from which steam was billowing. Snow was falling into the porridge and melting. Halvar stood nearby, holding the ladle the way one holds a weapon before a battle. Aunt Grethe, the cook, was wiping her hands on her apron and looking at the Baron as if he were crazy. The refugees didn't approach. They sat by the campfires and watched. 200 pairs of eyes. No one moved. They were waiting for a trick. They were used to the fact that only bad things came from the people at the castle. Daniel took a clay bowl. He scooped up some porridge. He walked over to the nearest campfire. A woman was sitting there with 2 children, a boy of about 5, a younger girl. Both were wrapped in a single cloak. Daniel held out the bowl to the woman. She didn't take it. She looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with nothing but fear. He crouched down. He set the bowl on the ground in front of her. He told her the porridge was hot, that she could come closer, that there was enough for everyone. Then he stood up and went to the pot for a second bowl. The girl reached out first. A small, dirty hand poked out from under the cloak and grabbed the bowl with both palms. Her mother flinched, trying to stop her. She was too late. The girl was already eating, greedily, burning herself. Porridge dripped down her chin. And then the others stood up, not all at once. First 3, then 5 more. Then a line formed on its own, silently, without pushing. People approached and held out whatever they could use to hold the porridge. Bowls, pots, helmets. One old man held out his cupped hands. Daniel poured for each person himself. Halvar ladled. Greta stoked the fire. The pot was empty in 30 minutes. Daniel ordered a second batch to be cooked. There was enough flour left for 2 days. He knew that. He knew that tomorrow he'd have to figure out where to get more. But right now, right this very moment, 200 people were eating a hot meal for the first time in a week. He looked at them, and the panel above his heart flashed. The number changed. Satisfied souls. 12 out of 3,400. Daily intake. 14 copper coins. 12. Out of 3,400. He closed his eyes. 12. It was a start. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study by candlelight, reading the promissory notes line by line. Someone else's memory helped with the language, but he understood the numbers even without it. Headmark Province was dead. On paper and, for all intents and purposes, in reality. A year and a half ago, war had swept through these lands. They called it the Rotten War. A mercenary army from a neighboring duchy marched through the forests and burned 3/4 of the villages to the ground. They poisoned the Salvan River. They stole the livestock. They killed those who hadn't fled. Those who fled became refugees. 200 of them were now sitting in the castle courtyard. The rest had scattered across the province, through the burned-out villages, through the forests. The former Baron, the father of this body, could not bear the shame. He did not die in battle. He sat down at this very table, looked at these very papers, and died. His heart stopped. The doctor said it was from grief. Halvar said it was from shame. Daniel thought it was from both at once. He set the papers aside. He rubbed his eyes. The eyes were someone else's, but the fatigue was his own. He opened the system panel. It unfurled at his mental command like an invisible scroll. Catalog of requests. He could order an item from his own world. Once a week, using his accumulated points. A bag of cement cost 10 satisfied souls. A blueprint for a mill, 100. A medical handbook, 500. A printing press,
3,000. He had 12. 12 souls. 14 kopecks a day. A province that owes 200,000 crowns. 3 neighbors waiting for him to fall. A winter that won't end for another 3 months. And 5 sacks of flour.
He told himself quietly once more. All right, I've seen worse. The morning began with a scream. Daniel woke up at the table. His cheek was pressed against the promissory note. Someone was screaming outside the door, a woman's voice, sharp and high-pitched. He stood up and went out into the hallway. Standing by the stairs was a woman of about 35 in a dark dress with a high collar. Her face was beautiful but stern. Her eyes were like 2 nails. She was yelling at Halvar, his stepmother. A distant memory supplied the name. Lady Violet, his father's second wife. She'd married the old baron 3 years ago, not for love, out of self-interest. Her family had received trading privileges. The baron had a young, beautiful face by his side in the House of Lords. Now the baron is dead, and those privileges hang by a thread. Violet saw Daniel and fell silent. She looked down at him, even though he was taller. She said she'd heard that last night he'd been feeding porridge to filthy refugees in the courtyard, from the castle's stores, with his own hands. She said it was a disgrace, that the neighbors already knew. The Baron Gronsk had sent a letter that morning, expressing sympathy that the young Baron Hedmark had apparently lost his mind from grief. She said they needed to write to the Imperial Guardian immediately, that the province would be placed under the administration of an adult, that it would be better for everyone that way. Daniel listened in silence. He looked at Violet and saw not a wicked woman, but a frightened one. She was clinging to the only thing she knew, to the rules, to order, to how a baron ought to behave. He said he thanked her for her concern, that he wouldn't be writing to the Imperial Guardian, that instead he'd like to ask her one thing. Violet raised an eyebrow. He asked if she knew how many cows were left in the province. Violet turned silently and walked away. Halvar stood by the wall, staring at the floor. Daniel approached him and said he needed a complete inventory of everything in the castle. Every sack of grain, every barrel of salted meat, every blanket, every nail, by noon. Halvar nodded and left. Daniel went down into the courtyard. The snow had stopped, but the sky was gray and low. Refugees sat by the extinguished fires. He walked among them. He looked. He counted. He listened. Coughing. Lots of coughing. Children's coughs. Wet coughs. Gaunt faces. Rags instead of clothes. Not a single man under 50. Everyone who could wield a sword or an axe had either left or been killed in the rotten war. Only the old men remained. Women. Children. He walked to the edge of the courtyard. There stood a man in chainmail, broad-shouldered, red-haired, with a face that had seen plenty of foreign blood and remained unmoved. Bjorn, captain of the castle guard. Bjorn looked at the baron and said that the guard was awaiting orders, that he had 23 men, that this would be enough to defend the castle against a minor raid, but not a serious attack, and that if the baron was going to waste flour on ragged refugees, in a month there would be nothing left to feed the guard. Daniel asked how much a mercenary cost per month. Bjorn said 15 crowns. Daniel asked how much a peasant who plowed the fields in the spring was worth. Bjorn didn't understand the question. Daniel said that every adult refugee in the courtyard represented 2 hands that would be planting grain in 3 months. That every child was a future worker or soldier. That every elderly person held the knowledge of where to find mushrooms in the forest and which ford across the river was shallow. Bjorn listened. His expression didn't change. He said the baron knew best and left. He didn't believe it, but he didn't argue. That was enough. By noon, Halvar brought the inventory. Daniel sat down at the table and read for 2 hours. The results were poor. 4 days' worth of flour, a week's worth of salted meat, a month's worth of salt, 10 days' worth of firewood in the castle, but an untouched spruce grove stood in the forest across the river. 12 horses, 3 carts, 8 cows, of which only 5 were being milked, 0 money in the treasury, debts totaling over 200,000. Tools were rusting in the castle's crafts wing. The smithy was abandoned. The mill on the Salvan River stood with its millstones broken. Daniel closed the inventory. He looked up at the ceiling. Then he opened the system panel. 14 satisfied souls. Yet 12 plus 2 new ones. 18 groschen in revenue. He scrolled through the catalog of requests. The cheapest thing he could order was a coil of rope for 3 points. A bag of cement was 10. A simple blueprint cost 20. He had 14. He thought for a moment. Then he ordered something that cost exactly 14 points. A survival guide for winter conditions. A thin paperback appeared on the table out of nowhere. It just appeared. No flash, no sound. As if it had always been there. He opened it. The text was in Korean. He read it through his own foreign eyes and understood every word. Building snow shelters, thermal insulation, traps for small game, edible winter roots, a simple system for heating an enclosed space with a minimum of firewood. He read for 2 hours. Then he went out into the courtyard and found Halvar. He said they needed to divide the refugees into groups, those able to work separately, the sick separately, and the children and elderly separately. Halvar asked why. Daniel said that tomorrow morning, those who could work would go into the forest to cut spruce trees. Not for free. Anyone who brings 10 logs will get hot porridge and a place in the castle for the night. Not in the courtyard, inside. Halvar said there was no room in the castle. Daniel said the large reception hall had been empty since his father's funeral, that it could fit 40 people on the floor, that it wasn't forever, that it was for 2 weeks, until they build shelters. Halvar asked what kind of shelters. Daniel showed him a page from a handbook. Frame shelters with double walls made of poles stuffed with pine needles and leaves. Simple, quick, warm. Halvar looked at the drawing and didn't understand. Daniel said he'd show him himself, tomorrow, in person. That afternoon, he went to the refugee camp and heard about the illness for the first time. The children were sick. Bloody diarrhea. 1 or 2 children died every day. An old healer named Fergus spread his hands and said it was the wrath of the spirits of the Salvan River, that the river had been poisoned by the war, that the spirits were taking revenge. Daniel didn't argue with the healer. He walked along the stream where they drew their water. He walked 200 paces upstream, and he found what he was looking for. 3 latrines, further upstream. Everything that flowed out of them went straight into the water the people drank. He stood on the bank of the stream and looked at the murky water. Then he closed his eyes. It wasn't the wrath of the spirits. It was dysentery. He knew that smell. He knew that scene. He'd seen it in refugee camps in Syria, in villages in the Balkans. It was the same everywhere. Dirty water kills more people than any army. He returned to the castle. He found Halvar. He said he needed 6 large cauldrons, all the salt they had, all the sugar they had, clean rags, and 20 men with shovels. Halvar asked why. Daniel said the children don't die from ghosts but from dirty water, that he would show how to stop it. Halvar was silent for a moment. Then he said that Dr. Fergus would be against it. Daniel said that Fergus could be against it all he wanted, but tomorrow morning the pits would be moved further down the stream, the water would be boiled, and the children would stop dying. He said this calmly, without anger, without shouting, like a man who states the obvious and is tired of having to explain the obvious. Halvar nodded, and did what was asked of him. That night, Daniel felt for the first time what would later become a part of his life. A quiet twinge in his heart. Not pain, a sense of direction, like a compass needle pointing not north, but toward trouble. Somewhere in the east of the province, in a burned-down village, a woman hadn't gotten out of bed. Somewhere in the south, 2 men were arguing over a property line, and one had already reached for his knife. Somewhere, a child was crying, and no one was coming to help. He could sense it all, vaguely, like a noise behind a wall. 3,400 people, and almost all of them were suffering right now. He lay down on the narrow bed in the Baron's room. The mattress was stuffed with straw. The ceiling was low and dark. He lay there and thought, not about the system, not about his debts. He thought about how, in his past life, he'd had a phone, and he could have called his mom and told her that everything was fine, even if it wasn't true. Here, he didn't have a phone, or a mom, or anything good to say. But he had 200 people who'd eaten a hot meal today, and 14 of them were satisfied. He closed his eyes and fell asleep. On the 4th day, the last child died, a 6-year-old boy. He was too weak by the time they started boiling water and giving him a saline solution. His body couldn't handle it. His mother sat on the ground, holding him. She didn't cry. She just sat there. Daniel stood nearby. He didn't know what to say. In a past life, he had seen children die in camps. It never got any easier. Never. He dropped to one knee and told the mother that her son would be buried properly, with his name on a headstone. She looked up. There was nothing in her eyes, just emptiness. She said his name was Toby,
Daniel repeated it. Toby. He remembered. He stood up and left. Halvar was waiting at the castle gate. He said that pots of boiling water were set up at 4 points around the camp, that the graves had been moved further down the stream, that Dr. Fergus had called the Baron a madman and said the river spirits would grow even angrier. Daniel asked if anyone had died the previous day. Halvar said no. Daniel said the river spirits would survive. On the 5th day, no one died, nor on the 6th. On the 7th, a mother with 2 little girls approached Halvar and asked where the young gentleman was who had ordered the water to be boiled. Halvar pointed to Daniel, who at that moment was standing knee-deep in the snow by the castle wall, using a stick to sketch a layout of the shelters on the ground. The woman approached. She bowed. She held out something wrapped in a rag, a hard-boiled egg. It was all she had. Daniel took the egg. He looked at it, then at the woman. He said he would accept it, that it was an honor. The woman began to cry and left. Halvar stood nearby, silent. His face betrayed no emotion, but his hands clenched the hem of his caftan so tightly that his knuckles turned white. That morning, Daniel checked the treasury chest. It stood in the castle's basement, a heavy oak chest reinforced with iron. Yesterday, it had been empty. Today, coins lay at the bottom. Silver crowns. He counted them. 412. 412 silver crowns had appeared out of nowhere overnight. The system had counted the souls. People who had stopped losing their children. People who drank clean water. People who ate a hot meal. Their contentment had turned to silver. He stood over the chest and counted. 412 crowns. The first payment to the crown, 120,000. It was like trying to fill a lake with a handful of sand. But yesterday he had nothing, and today, 412. He closed the chest and went upstairs. Halvar was standing by the door. Daniel told him to go downstairs and check the chest. Halvar went downstairs. He returned 10 minutes later. His face was pale. He asked where it came from. Daniel said it would take too long to explain, that for now, he was asking him to simply accept it as a fact. Halvar was silent. Then he took off his hat. He pressed it to his chest, and he bowed. For the first time in a year and a half. Not as a servant, as a man who, for the first time in a long time, had seen something he couldn't explain but wanted to believe in. Daniel said they needed to buy flour, that he would send Halvar with a cart to the nearest trading town outside the province, that 300 crowns would go toward grain and flour, 50 for salt and sugar, the rest for reserves. Halvar put on his hat and went to get ready. That day, Daniel began building the first sheds. He took a book from the system. He went out to the group of 30 male refugees that Halvar had gathered in the courtyard. They stood there, gloomy, thin, distrustful. He didn't give a speech. He picked up an axe, for the first time in the life of this body. His hands wouldn't obey him. The axe struck the log crookedly and got stuck. One of the men snorted. Daniel pulled the axe out and tried again. It was even worse. Then he set the axe down. He looked at the men and said that he didn't know how to chop wood, that he needed their help, that he knew how to build a shelter that would be warm even with a small amount of firewood, that he would show them how, that everyone who worked would get porridge in the morning and evening and a place inside whatever they built. No one moved. Then a man in his 40s with one arm stepped forward from the back rows. He'd lost his other arm in the Rotten War. He said his name was Gunter and that he was a carpenter, or had been a carpenter, before the war. He asked what needed to be done. Daniel turned the book to the right page. He showed the drawing. He explained. A frame made of poles, double walls. The space between the walls is filled with pine needles, dry leaves, anything that retains heat. The roof is made of the same poles, covered with spruce branches and buried under earth. The entrance was on the leeward side. Inside, there was a space for a hearth with smoke vented through an opening at the top. Gunter listened. Then he said it could be done. Daniel nodded. Gunter looked at the others. The men began to approach, one by one, in silence. By evening, the first frame was standing, crooked, asymmetrical, but it stood. 10 men packed the pine needles between the walls. 5 chopped spruce branches for the roof. Gunter tied the poles together with one hand better than some carpenters could with 2. Daniel hauled branches. His body ached. His muscles trembled. His palms were covered with calluses on top of the calluses from the pen. He didn't stop. By nightfall, the shelter was ready. It could hold 20 people. The women and children went in first. Someone lit a small fire. Smoke rose through the opening. It was warm inside. Not hot, but warm. For the first time in a week. The little girl, the very one who had grabbed the bowl of porridge on the first evening, raised her hand and touched the wall of the shelter. Then she looked at Daniel and smiled. She was missing her 2 front teeth. The system panel flashed. Satisfied souls. 48. He stood outside, looking at the shelter where a fire was burning, and people were sitting in the warmth for the first time in a week. It had started snowing again, heavy, wet snow. He was cold. His arms were too tired to bend. He thought about how tomorrow he'd have to build 4 more of these, and fix the well at the castle, and sort out the flour, and somehow resolve the issue with Violet, who had been talking to Bjorn behind closed doors that morning. He thought about all of this, and at the same time, he thought about the little girl missing her 2 front teeth, who had touched the wall of the shelter and smiled. And he realized one thing. The system wasn't magic. The system was a mirror. It showed him what he already knew, that every person whose life improves even slightly isn't just an abstract number in a report. It's a living face, specific eyes, a specific smile missing 2 front teeth. The next morning, a young woman came to the castle gates, slender, with a very straight back. Her face was pale. Her eyes were dark and unblinking. She was dressed in gray. Her hair was tied back in a bun. She stood at the gate but did not enter. The guard asked who she was and what she wanted. She said her name was Irene Valsett, that she was the daughter of an official from the village of Upper Terra, that the village had been burned down, that her entire family had perished, that she was looking for her 10-year-old younger brother named Run, that someone had told her the boy might have made it to Headmark with the refugees. The guard sent for Halvar. Halvar brought her to Daniel. She stood in the Baron's office and did not sit down, even though he offered her a seat. Her back was straight. Her hands were at her sides. She repeated her story. Her voice was steady. Not a single unnecessary word. Daniel listened and observed. He saw not what she was saying, but what she wasn't saying. Her clenched fingers, her white-knuckled nails, her lips, which didn't tremble only because she was biting them from the inside. She was on the verge of breaking. She was holding on, but she was on the brink. He asked if she could read. She said yes. Write? Yes. Count? Yes. He asked if she wanted to stay at the castle while she searched for her brother, not out of charity, for work. He needed someone who could read, count, and keep quiet. In the kitchen, right now. We'll see. She paused. Then she said yes. He nodded and called for Greta. Irene Valsett went to the kitchen. She didn't say thank you. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She just left. And Daniel thought that there was more steel in this girl than in the entire castle guard, including Bjorn. The first month passed like one long day without dawn. Daniel got up before daybreak and went to bed after midnight. Between those 2 points, he did so much that Halvar stopped asking questions and simply began taking notes. There were now 7 shelters. 130 people lived in them. The rest of the refugees occupied the great hall and 2 empty wings of the castle. The courtyard was cleared of debris. The well in the castle was repaired. The water from it was murky but clean. Halvar returned from the market town with 2 carts of flour and a sack of salt. 300 crowns were spent. 112 remained in the treasury. The system dispensed coins every night, sometimes 30 silver coins, sometimes 50, sometimes 200 if it was a good day. The number of satisfied souls had reached 190. Daniel watched the number as closely as a doctor monitors a patient's pulse. Every upward spike meant that someone had eaten, had warmed up, had stopped being afraid. Every drop meant that something had gone wrong. The drops happened often. He had learned to sense the province. The quiet twinges in his heart had become part of life. One morning he woke up and told Halvar that someone in the village of Nizhny Krog was sick. Halvar asked how he knew. Daniel didn't answer. He sent Bjorn with 2 guards to check it out. They returned by evening. In Nizhny Krog, 3 children had come down with a fever. Bjorn looked at the Baron with new eyes, not as a madman, but as something incomprehensible. Violet didn't give up. She didn't write to the Guardian, yet, but she spoke, from morning till night, to anyone who would listen. She said the Baron was spending his last money on filthy refugees, that he was digging pits and boiling water like a countrywoman, that the neighbors were laughing, that the House of Crane had already sent a letter offering to buy the western pastures for half the price. She wasn't stupid. She was dangerous. Daniel thought about her every evening. He couldn't kick her out. She was his father's widow.
Under imperial law, she had the right to live in the castle for the rest of her life. He couldn't silence her. She was telling the truth. The neighbors really were laughing. The money really was dwindling, and the Crane House's offer was real. He decided not to touch her for now. Let her talk. As long as he had results, Violet's words were no more dangerous than the winter wind. Much ado about nothing. In the third week, the first real test arrived. A horseman in a coat of arms adorned cloak rode up to the castle gates and handed Halvar a sealed letter. The seal was red, the crown's coat of arms. The imperial chancellery reminded Baron Hedmark that the first installment on the debt, amounting to 20,000 crowns, must be paid by the beginning of summer. In the event of non-payment, the province would be put up for auction. The deadline? 4.5 months. Daniel read the letter 3 times. 20,000 crowns by summer. There was just over 600 in the treasury. The system yielded an average of 50 to 70 crowns a day. At that rate, there would be between 7 and 10,000 by summer, half of what was needed. He needed to double the number of satisfied souls, or find another source of income, or both at once. He sat down at the table. He spread out a map of the province in front of him, an old one, with wax stains. All the villages of Hedmark were marked on it, 32. Of those, 24 had been burned or abandoned. 8 were still inhabited. 3,400 residents were scattered across these 8 villages and the castle. He looked at the map and thought. Then he called for Irene. In 3 weeks, she had moved from the kitchen to the study. Not because he'd planned it, because Greta had said the girl could calculate faster than she could chew and had nothing to do among the pots and pans. Irene came in. She sat down across from him. Her back was straight. Her hands were on her knees. She was waiting. He placed a letter in front of her. She read it. Her expression didn't change. He asked what she thought. She said that 20,000 crowns in 4 months was impossible for a province that didn't have a single functioning factory. He said he knew. She said the only way was to sell the land, the western pastures, or the northern forest. He said no. She looked at him, and for the first time in 3 weeks something stirred in her eyes. Not a smile, something like curiosity. He unfolded the map. He showed her 3 points. The village of Upper Terra, her hometown, burned to the ground. The village of Elmark, on the river, also burned down, and the crossroads between them. He said that this crossroads stood on the site of what used to be a trading post, that a road ran through it from the western pastures to the river. What if they set up a simple market at this crossroads? A canopy, stalls, a place for carts. Then trade would flow through it between the southern villages that are still standing and the western lands of House Crane. Irene listened. Then she said there was nothing to trade. He said that was true for now, but in 2 months it will be spring. The cows will start producing milk. The forest will yield resin and tar. Refugees who are able-bodied will start making simple things. Ropes, baskets, clay pottery. Things that everyone needs and that no one makes because everyone is too busy just surviving. He said the first step was not to trade. The first step was to make sure there was something to sell in Hedmark. And for that, he needed workshops. Simple ones, made from whatever was available. Irene was silent for a minute. Then she asked what she needed to do. He said he needed a list. Every refugee, name, age, where they came from, what they can do. Everyone. All 3,400 of them. She said it would take 2 weeks. He said she had 10 days. She stood up and left. No questions, no complaints. 10 days later, she placed 27 sheets of paper on his desk. Small, neat handwriting. Each person, name, age, skills. He read through these lists for 2 days, searching. Among the 3,400 people were 14 carpenters, 6 masons, 9 weavers, 1 potter, 2 former merchants, 1 miller without a mill, 3 blacksmiths, 2 of whom were wounded and unable to work, and Gunther, a one-armed carpenter who had built the first shelter. Daniel looked at the lists and smiled for the first time in a month. These weren't mouths to feed. These were hands that could work. He unfolded the map and began to draw. Gunther was the first to refuse. Daniel gathered 14 carpenters in the castle courtyard and explained the plan. 3 workshops, carpentry, pottery, and weaving. Each workshop contributes to a common fund. 1/3 of the output goes to the craftsmen, 1/3 goes to the provincial treasury, 1/3 for barter and trade. He drew with a stick on the packed snow, squares, arrows, numbers. The carpenters looked at him as if he were telling a fairy tale. Gunther raised his only hand and said it all sounded nice, but you can't build a workshop out of sticks and pine needles. You need lumber, good wood, dry wood.
We need tools, we need nails, we need a roof, and they have none of that. Daniel nodded. He'd been expecting this. He said there was wood. There's a spruce forest across the river. That there were tools in the castle's crafts wing, rusty but there. That nails could be forged if they could find a blacksmith. Gunter said the blacksmiths were maimed. One had lost his legs, the other had a broken back. There was no one to do the forging. Daniel said there was one more blacksmith, or rather, one woman. Everyone fell silent. He told them about a girl who had come to Hedmark 2 weeks ago with her dwarf father. Her father had died of his wounds a month after their arrival.
The girl is 17. Her name is Sona. She knows how to work a forge. Gunter said the girl wouldn't be able to handle the hammer. Daniel said a hammer isn't the only way to forge, and that he wanted to talk to her first. Then we'll decide. The carpenters went their separate ways. Not convinced, but they hadn't refused either. Daniel went to look for Sona. He found her at an abandoned smithy in the castle's backyard. She was sitting on the threshold, sharpening a knife. Small, thin, dark, short hair. Her hands bore old burn scars. A hammer lay on her lap, heavy, dwarven made, with the craftsman's mark on the handle, her father's hammer. She looked up when he approached. She looked up at him from below. Her eyes were gray and angry. She said that if the Baron had come to take the smithy, he should know that the smithy was already empty. There was nothing to take. Daniel sat down next to her on the threshold. She moved away. He said he hadn't come to take it away. He'd come to ask. She remained silent. He asked if she knew how to forge nails. She snorted and said her father had forged swords for the dwarf lords, and here the Baron was asking about nails. Daniel said swords were wonderful, but right now he needed nails, 500 of them, for the workshops. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said she could forge 500 nails, but the hammer was too heavy. She could work with it for half an hour, then her hands would give out. She said this calmly, as a matter of fact, but he saw a muscle twitch in her jaw. Shame, rage, the pain of her body failing to live up to what her mind knew. He knew that feeling. 3 weeks ago, he himself hadn't been able to hit a log with an axe. He said there was another way. She raised an eyebrow. He asked if there was a spot on the river where the water fell from a height, a rapids or a ledge. She said there was, upstream from Solvena, a rocky rapids. The water falls from a height roughly equal to a person's height. Daniel nodded. He opened the system panel. 208 satisfied souls. The request catalog had been updated. He found what he was looking for, a blueprint for a water-powered mechanical hammer. Cost, 200 soul points. He had 208, just enough. He placed the order. The scroll appeared on his lap. Thin, thick paper. The ink was crisp. A diagram of the water hammer, a wheel, a camshaft, a hammer on a lever. Water turns the wheel lifts the hammer falls, over and over, tirelessly, without hands. Sona stared at the drawing. She didn't blink. Then she reached out and traced her finger along the line of the camshaft. She asked where it came from. He said it didn't matter. What mattered was that if they built this contraption at the river's mouth, she wouldn't have to hold the hammer for half an hour. The water would hold it for her. Sona was silent. She looked at the blueprint and didn't look up. Then she said quietly that her father had dreamed his whole life of a forge where the hammer worked on its own. He used to tell her about it when she was little. She thought he was making it up. Daniel didn't say anything. He just left her the blueprint and walked out. The next morning, Sona came into the office, without knocking. She placed the blueprint on the desk and said that the design was workable, that she needed 3 carpenters, 2 masons, iron for the shaft, and a month. Daniel nodded. She turned to leave. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she said that if the Baron thought she'd be grateful to him for this, he was mistaken. She was doing it for her father, not for the Baron. Daniel said that suited him perfectly. She left. Irene was sitting in the corner of the office, pretending not to have been listening. A minute later, she said that this girl was very mean. Daniel said no. She's very proud. That's different. Construction began. 5 carpenters, led by Gunter, started building the first workshop, the carpentry shop, at the far end of the castle courtyard, next to the wall. They cut down trees in the spruce forest across the river and hauled the timber in on 2 carts. They worked from dawn till dusk. Each worker received porridge in the morning and evening and 1 silver krone a week. It wasn't much, but it was money. For the first time in a year and a half, the people of Hedmark were being paid for their work. At the same time, Daniel set about establishing a pottery workshop. The only potter in the province was an old man named Olaf, 62 years old, quiet. His hands were large and soft, like those of anyone who'd spent their whole life kneading clay. He'd come to the castle when his village burned down, and ever since then he'd sat by the fire, speaking to no one. His wife had died in a raid. His children had scattered. He was left alone with his hands and nothing else. Daniel went to see him. He sat down beside him. He was silent. Olaf was silent. They sat there for about 10 minutes. Then Daniel said that there wasn't a single pot in the province for storing grain, that there would be nowhere to store the harvest they would sow in the spring, that mice would eat half of it, that he needed pots, lots of pots, big and sturdy ones. Olaf didn't look up. He said he didn't have a potter's wheel. No kiln, no clay. Daniel said there was clay, on the south bank of the Solven, red, rich. He'd seen it when he went to look at the site for the water hammer. Olaf looked up for the first time. Red and rich? He asked. Daniel said yes. Olaf said that the red, rich clay from the South Shore was the best there could be, that his grandfather had used it to make pottery that wouldn't break for 20 years. His eyes lit up. For the first time in 6 months. He said he needed a wheel, a simple one, a wooden one, and a pit for firing. Not a kiln, a pit, with good draft. He knows how to do it himself. Daniel said that Gunther would start making the wheel tomorrow, and Olaf would dig the pit himself, if he could. Olaf stood up. He straightened up. He was a head taller than Daniel. He said he could, and he walked down to the river to look at the clay. Irene stood nearby and watched him go. She said the Baron talks to people in a strange way. Daniel asked what she meant. She said he doesn't give orders. He asks. And then he makes it so that the person decides on their own to help. Daniel said that wasn't a trick. The people who are forced to work do a poor job. People who decide on their own work well. That's not philosophy, it's math. Irene was silent for a moment. Then she said that the Baron's math was strange. He smiled. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched. By the end of the month, the carpentry workshop was standing. Small, log-built, with a roof of spruce branches and tar. Inside were 4 workbenches. The tools had been cleaned of rust. Gunther stood in the middle and looked around. Then he looked at his only hand. Then at Daniel. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and started working. Olaf shaped his first pot a week after receiving the potter's wheel. It was large, red, heavy. He fired it in a pit he'd dug himself, brought it to the castle, set it on the table in front of Daniel, tapped it with his knuckles. The sound was clear and resonant. Olaf said the pot would last 20 years. Daniel said he needed 200 of them. Olaf said that would require apprentices. Daniel said that among the refugees there were 8 teenagers who knew how to do nothing and had nowhere else to go. Olaf was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd take 4. That was all he could handle. Daniel agreed. The system responded. There were now 320 satisfied souls. Money was flowing into the treasury, not like a river, but like a trickle. But it was flowing. 28 days. 600 refugees in shelters. 200 are working. 1 workshop is up and running. A second is on the way. A water hammer is in the works. The well is working. The children aren't dying. And there were 2,400 kroner in the treasury. 17,600 more were needed before the summer payment. 4 months until summer. Daniel sat in his office at night, staring at the numbers. Irene sat across from him, transcribing the refugee registry. She did this every evening, updating it. Who had arrived, who had left, who had been born, who had died. She looked up and said that there was no one named Run among the new refugees from the south. Daniel looked at her. Her face was calm. Only her knuckles had turned white. He said they would find him. She didn't reply. She lowered her head and continued writing. The second month began with a freeze, so severe that a spit would freeze before it hit the ground. The Solven River had frozen over. Thick ice sealed off the water, and with it, her plans for a water hammer. Sona stood on the bank, staring at the frozen rapids. Her face was expressionless. Her hands were clenched into fists. She didn't say a word. She turned and went into the smithy. An hour later, the sound of hammering came from inside. She was forging nails by hand. Her father's hammer struck the anvil for 30 minutes, then silence, then another 30 minutes. She worked in bursts, half an hour of forging, half an hour's rest, half an hour of forging. By evening, she had made 40 nails. Daniel walked into the forge. She was sitting on the floor. Her hands were shaking. Her fingers wouldn't straighten. He didn't tell her she was doing a great job. He didn't feel sorry for her. He said that 40 nails a day meant 800 a month, that he needed 1,200 for the 3 workshops, that in a month and a half, she'd be done. Sona raised her head. She looked at him. She said that the Baron scholar knew how to count. What a surprise. He left. Behind him, the clang of the hammer rang out again.
The frost brought more than just ice. It brought hunger. The flour ran out in 2 weeks. Halvar said that grain prices in the trading town had doubled. Winter was harsh throughout the north. Everyone was stocking up. Daniel had 3,000 crowns in his treasury. If he spent 1,000 on flour at the new price, he'd get half as much as last time. And by summer, he needed to save 20,000. He sat at the table and did the math. Irene sat across from him. She said there was another option. Daniel looked up. She said that 20 versts to the west lay the village of Kaldern. It belonged to House Crane. The village was large and prosperous. They have a granary, and they trade in flour. But not for money, for labor. The Cranes have always hired lumberjacks from Hedmark to cut down their eastern forest. It was cheaper than paying their own people. Now there are no lumberjacks. The forest hasn't been cut for a year and a half. The Cranes need timber. Hedmark has people. Daniel listened. Then he asked how she knew all this. Irene said her father had been a civil servant and kept the trade ledgers for Upper Tara. She remembers the entries. Daniel looked at her. A quiet girl with a straight back who remembers the trade records of her father from a burned-down village. He said it was a good plan, but to do that, they'd have to send people into the territory of House Crane and negotiate with them. Irene said she could write a letter, an official one, on behalf of Baron Hedmark, with a proposal for an exchange, labor for flour. He told her to write it. She wrote it in an hour. The text was dry and precise, not a single superfluous word. The wording was flawless. Daniel read it and made no corrections. He affixed his seal. Bjorn took the letter with 2 guards. The reply arrived 4 days later. The House of Crane agreed. 30 lumberjacks for 2 months. In exchange, Hedmark would receive 20 cartloads of flour and 10 barrels of salted meat. There was one condition. The lumberjacks would work on the Crane family's lands, under their supervision. And if any of them ran away, Hedmark would pay a penalty, 200 crowns per head. Daniel read the terms. He looked at Irene. She said the terms were strict but fair. The Cranes don't trust him, and they're right not to. They don't know the new Baron. He nodded. He selected 30 men, the strongest ones. He explained the terms. He explained that this wasn't slavery, that it was work. 2 months. They'd return with the flour. Each man would receive 5 crowns in addition to food. The men agreed, not all at once. Some remembered that under the old Baron, such offers had ended badly, but hunger was more persuasive than any words. The group left 2 days later. Halvar said that if the Cranes were deceived, those 30 men simply wouldn't return. Daniel said the Cranes wouldn't be deceived, because they needed the forest more than they needed 30 hungry men. Halvar wasn't convinced, but he kept quiet. While the lumberjacks were working for the Cranes, Daniel set about other business. He took Bjorn and 5 guards and rode through the province. For the first time ever, he rode farther from the castle than just the courtyard. The road was frozen and bumpy. The wagon creaked over every bump. His body ached from the cold. Bjorn rode alongside him, saying nothing. The first village, Lower Krog. 18 houses, 7 of them intact. The rest were charred walls without roofs. 43 residents, old people, women, children. The village elder, a man in his 60s named Willem, met them at the edge of the village. He bowed to the Baron and said he was glad to see the young gentleman. His voice told a different story. His voice said he wasn't glad to see anyone from the castle because people from the castle always came to collect taxes. Daniel climbed down from the cart. He walked over to Willem. He asked how much food there was in the village. Willem said there was enough for 3 weeks if they rationed it. Daniel asked how many cows there were. 2. Horses? None. Goats? 5. Chickens? 12. He took notes. Irene stood nearby and took notes as well. Willem looked at them, puzzled. A baron counting other people's chickens. Daniel walked around the village. He looked at the houses, at the well. The well was in bad shape. The wooden frame was rotten. The water was murky. He asked Willem when the well had last been cleaned. Willem said he didn't remember. Maybe 3 years ago. Maybe 5. Daniel said the well needed to be cleaned every year. That murky water spreads disease. Willem said he'd been drinking murky water his whole life and was still alive. Daniel didn't argue. He asked how many children had died in the village over the past year. Willem fell silent. Then he said 4. Daniel asked what they died of. Willem said of a fever and of stomach problems. Daniel asked if the children had drunk water from the well. Willem was silent. Then he said they had. Daniel didn't mention the word connection. He said that if Willem agreed, he would send 2 men to help clean out the well and build a new log cabin. For free. Willem asked what the catch was. Daniel said there was no catch, that the Baron needs living peasants, not dead ones. That a dead peasant doesn't pay taxes, doesn't plow the land, and doesn't have children. Willem looked at him for a very long time. Then he said that the Baron says strange things. But a new log cabin wouldn't hurt. They visited 5 villages in a week. The picture was the same everywhere. Ruined houses, muddy wells, emaciated people, supplies at their limit, and mistrust. A huge, deep-seated mistrust of anyone who comes from the castle. Every time, Daniel did the same thing. He counted. He took notes. He asked questions. He didn't give orders. And he offered help. Concrete help. A well, a shed, seeds for spring. Not generosity, calculation. He spoke plainly to the village elders. I need you to be alive by spring, so you can plow the fields, so you can harvest the crops, so I can pay my debt to the crown. If you die, I'll die too. That's the extent of my kindness. It was blunt, but it was clear. The elders nodded, not out of love, out of common sense. They returned to the castle 10 days later. Daniel laid out the records on the table. Irene helped sort them. Bjorn stood by the door and listened. For the first time in 2 months, he didn't leave right away. Daniel spoke aloud.
5 villages, 230 residents, 16 wells, 9 of which are working, little livestock. Each village has enough food for 3 weeks at most. Spring is 2.5 months away. If they don't make it to spring, people will start leaving, or dying. Bjorn asked what the Baron planned to do. Daniel said that tomorrow he would send 2 men to each village to repair the wells. Halvar would take 2 sacks of flour from the castle's reserves to each village. This would reduce the castle's reserves, but increase the chances that there would be people left to plow the fields in the spring. Bjorn said that if the castle gave away the flour, the guards would run out of food in 10 days. Daniel said that in 8 days, the lumberjacks would return with flour from the cranes. Bjorn asked what would happen if they didn't return. Daniel looked at him and said that things would be bad then. Bjorn was silent for a moment. Then he nodded and said he would send 2 guards with each cart of flour for protection. Daniel thanked him. Bjorn left. Irene looked up from her notes and said that for the first time, the captain hadn't called the plan madness. Daniel said that was progress. The lumberjacks returned on the 9th day, all 30 of them, alive, with 20 wagons of flour and 10 barrels of salted meat. The cranes hadn't lied. The men were tired but well fed. For the first time in months, they'd earned a living. Real work for real pay. One of them, an old man named Tormund, approached Daniel and said that the crane overseers had asked where the headmark men got such discipline. They don't drink. They don't fight. They work from dawn till dusk. Daniel asked what they'd replied. Tormund said they'd answered that the Baron pays for work, not for obedience, and that in Headmark, they feed not those who keep quiet, but those who get things done. Daniel looked at Tormund and thought that was the best advertisement he could have come up with. The cranes now know that Headmark has a workforce, reliable, cheap, and that the new Baron is someone you can do business with. The panel flashed. 480 satisfied souls. The treasury was growing. 3,800 crowns. Still a long way from 20,000, but the stream was getting wider. Spring arrived unexpectedly, not with warmth, but with mud. The snow had turned to slush. The roads had turned to mud. The carts were stuck up to their hubs, and the Salvan River broke open overnight with a crash that could be heard all the way at the castle. Sona stood on the bank at 5 in the morning. The water churned and foamed over the stone rapids. The ice was gone. She turned to Daniel, who had followed her, and said it was time. Building the water hammer took 3 weeks. Sona supervised. Gunter built the frame. 2 masons laid the foundation. 10 men hauled stones and logs. Daniel helped where he could. His body had grown stronger over the 2 months of work. The calluses on his palms had hardened. His muscles no longer trembled with fatigue by evening. He was still thin and pale, but this was now a body that knew how to do things. They installed the wheel on the 7th day. It was large, made of wood, with blades that Sona had forged herself. Water struck the blades and the wheel jerked. Once. Then again. Then it seized up. Sona waded waist-deep into the icy water and spent 2 hours adjusting the angle of the blades. She emerged blue from the cold. The wheel began to turn, smoothly, powerfully, without stopping. On the 14th day, they installed the shaft. On the 20th, the hammer. Sona stood before the finished structure and didn't move. The hammer rose and fell, rhythmically, heavily, blow after blow. The water turned the wheel turned the shaft lifted the hammer struck the anvil, without hands, without fatigue, without stopping. She placed a piece of iron on the anvil. The hammer struck. The iron flattened out evenly and cleanly. She placed a second piece, a third, the 10th. In an hour, she made as many nails as she used to make in a day. The carpenters stood on the bank and watched. No one spoke.
Gunter scratched his chin with his one hand and said quietly that in 30 years of the trade, he'd never seen anything like it. Sona turned around. Her eyes were wet. Her lips were pressed together. She looked at Daniel and opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she shouted at him not to dare look. She turned away and began hammering again. Daniel looked away. Irene stood nearby. She said quietly that the girl was crying. Daniel said he knew. Irene said maybe they should go over to her. Daniel said no, not now.
Let her cry in her own smithy. It's her smithy. Irene looked at him and nodded. Spring brought more than just warmth. It brought work. Lots of work. The fields needed to be plowed. Seeds needed to be gathered. There were 12 horses. For a proper plowing job, at least 30 were needed. Daniel solved the problem differently. He gathered the village elders from 5 villages and proposed a communal plowing effort. All the horses in the province would work on all the fields in turn, one village after another, in a rotation. The elders argued for 3 hours. Everyone wanted their fields plowed first. Daniel listened. Then he took out Irene's list, a list of all the fields in all the villages, with their sizes and soil types. He spread it out on the table and showed the order of plowing, not by importance, but by geography. Start with the southern fields because they thaw first, then move north. Each village would receive horses for exactly as many days as needed to plow its area. No more, no less. He drew the routes on the map. Irene called out the numbers. The village elders looked at the map and remained silent. Willem from Lower Krog said it made sense. The others agreed. Not happily, but they agreed. Plowing began in mid-March. Daniel bought the seeds for 800 crowns in the market town. Barley, rye, a little oats, expensive. But without seeds, the land is barren, and barren land does not feed. By early April, 3 fields had been sown. People were working. For the first time in a year and a half, the usual normal spring work was taking place in Hedmark. The farmers walked behind the plow. The women scattered the grain. The children ran along the field boundaries. Halvar stood next to Daniel on the hill above the southern field and looked down. He was silent for a long time. Then he said that the old baron had also stood on that hill once. 3 years ago, before the war. Back then, the fields were green as far as the eye could see. Daniel said they would be again. Halvar looked at him and said nothing. But his eyes were different. Not tired, alive. Something else happened that same month. A woman came to the castle, tall, thin, with gray hair tied in a simple knot, wearing a gray habit without insignia, tired eyes, a quiet voice. 12 children followed her. The youngest was barely a toddler. The oldest was 12. The youngest was 4. She said her name was Mairead O'Shea, that she was a former novice at the convent of St. Agnes in the southern part of the province, that the convent had been burned down, the sisters had perished. She had led the children through the forest and had been walking for 2 months. The children were silent. They stood behind her, holding on to one another, a little chain. Not a single adult besides her. Daniel looked at them, then at Mairead. He asked if she'd eaten today. She said the children had eaten. He didn't ask again. He called Greta and told her to feed all 13 of them a hot meal, right now. Then he took Mairead to his office. She sat down, for the first time in 2 months. He saw how she clung to the armrests, as if she were afraid the chair would disappear. He asked what she needed. She said she needed a place for the children, shelter, food, safety, that she was ready to work, that she knew how to teach, that at the monastery she'd taught classes for children from the surrounding villages, reading and writing, arithmetic, the Word of God. Daniel listened. Then he said he had a proposal for her. Not a job, a position. He wanted to open a school, the first one in Hedmark, for those 12 children and for anyone else who wanted to attend. Mairead looked at him and blinked for the first time during the entire conversation. She asked why the Baron wanted a school. He said that 1 literate peasant was worth 10 illiterate ones, that a person who could count wouldn't let themselves be cheated at the market, that a person who could read could learn a new trade from a book, that a school wasn't an act of kindness, it was an investment. Mairead was silent. Then she said quietly that she'd never heard a baron call a school an investment. He said that barons usually can't count. She didn't smile. But something in her expression changed. She asked where the school would be. He said that for now, it would be in the castle, in one of the empty rooms on the 2nd floor. Later, they'll build a separate building. She asked what to hang on the wall, an icon or a coat of arms. He said it was her school. She could hang whatever she wanted. She was silent for a long time. Then she said she wanted to hang a towel, her mother's old towel, the only thing she had left.
He nodded. 3 days later, the school opened. A room on the second floor of the castle. 1 long table, 2 benches, 12 children, and Mayrid stood by the wall where a faded towel with red roosters hung. She stood in front of the children and was silent for a full minute. Then she began to speak, quietly, calmly. She taught them the letters, the first letter of the alphabet. The children listened. They sat upright. They watched her lips. Not a single one moved. Daniel stood by the door and listened. Halvar stood beside him.
Halvar said quietly that in his 40 years of service at this castle, this was the first time he'd heard children's voices on the second floor. Daniel didn't answer. He listened as Mayrid told the children to repeat after her, and 12 voices pronounced the first letter in unison, quietly, hesitantly, as if tasting something new. The system flashed. 520 satisfied souls. There were 2 months left until summer. There were 7,000 krone in the treasury. He needed 20,000. Daniel hadn't slept for 2 days. He pored over the numbers and realized that at the current pace, he wouldn't make it in time. The system yielded an average of 80 to 100 krone per day, 500 satisfied souls out of 3,400. To reach 20,000 by the deadline, he'd have to triple the revenue. And to do that, he'd have to satisfy not 500, but 1,500 people in 2 months. He spread out the map. He looked at it. He looked at Irene's lists. Then he closed his eyes and thought. In his past life, he'd worked with a small South Korean town that was dying. The young people were leaving. The elderly remained. There was no money. What saved that town? Not a factory, not a subsidy, a fair. A simple monthly fair that drew people from neighboring towns. They bought local honey, homemade cheese, knitted socks, clay pots, trifles. But trifles that gave people the feeling that their labor had value, that they weren't just surviving, they were selling, they were earning, they were needed. It dawned on him. A fair. The crossroads between Upper Terra and Elmark, the place Irene had mentioned 2 months ago. It was time. He called for Irene, Halvar, and Bjorn. For the first time, he gathered all 3 of them together. He laid out his plan. The fair in a month. At the crossroads. A canopy. Stalls. Space for carts. Security. He sent out invitations to all the inhabited villages of Hedmark and beyond. To the village of Cranes. To the market town. To anyone who wanted to sell or buy. Halvar asked what they would sell. Daniel said that in 2 months, Olaf and his students had made 70 pots. Sona had forged knives and door hinges. The weavers from the refugee camp had woven coarse cloth. Gunther's carpenters had made 20 stools and 10 tables. The women had dried fish from Solven, small items. But small items that could be sold. Bjorn said that if outsiders came to the fair, they would need security. Serious security. Daniel said he had 23 guards. Bjorn said that wasn't enough. Daniel looked at him. Bjorn said there were former soldiers among the refugees, 7 of them. He knew them, trustworthy. If they were given weapons and promised pay, they'd stand guard. Daniel said, "Go ahead." Bjorn nodded and left. That was the moment. Small, imperceptible, but Daniel sensed it. For the first time, Bjorn had offered a solution. Not an objection, a solution. Preparations for the fair took the entire month. Gunther and the carpenters erected a long canopy at the crossroads. 20 posts, a roof of planks, open on 2 sides. Olaf arranged the pots, red ones, ringing ones, each bearing his mark. The weavers laid out their cloth. Sona brought 3 dozen knives and 2 dozen staples from the smithy. The women from the camp displayed dried fish and smoked meat. Daniel looked at the stalls and thought that in any shopping center in Seoul, this would look pitiful. Here, it was a treasure. The day before the fair, a letter arrived from Baron Olfgar Gronsk. It was brief. He expressed surprise that the young Baron of Hedmark was organizing a market on land that rightfully belonged to the Gronsk family. He reminded him that Hedmark's eastern border was disputed, and that any commercial activity near the border without his consent would be regarded as a provocation. Daniel read the letter. He set it down on the table. He looked at Irene. She said that the crossroads was 4 versts from the border with Gronsk. According to all the maps, this was Hedmark territory. Olfgar was bluffing. Daniel said he knew that. He wrote a reply. Polite. Terse. He thanked him for his concern. He confirmed that the fair would take place on the scheduled date within Hedmark's territory. He invited the Baron of Gronsk to attend in person. Irene read the reply and said that the invitation was either bold or foolish. Daniel said he didn't know yet which of the 2 it was. The fair opened on the first day of May. It was overcast in the morning. By noon, the sun came out.
Merchants from Kalderna arrived. The village of Krinovskaya sent 3 carts loaded with fabrics and iron. A merchant named Morgan arrived from the trading town with a wagon full of spices and salt.
He was fat, cheerful, and very observant. He looked around and kept counting. Daniel saw this. The merchant was assessing the situation. Locals came on foot, from Lower Krog and from the 2 southern villages. Women carried baskets of eggs. Men hauled hides. Children ran between the stalls. Olaf's pots sold out in 2 hours, all 70 of them. Merchant Morgan bought 20 in bulk and asked if there were any more. Olaf stood behind the counter and couldn't believe it. People were buying his pots, his clay, his hands, his mark. He turned to Daniel and said he needed more apprentices. Daniel said, "Go for it." Sona's knives flew off the shelves even faster. The farmers from Kranov snapped them up without haggling. Good steel, a sharp edge, the mark of a dwarf craftsman on the handles. Sona stood by the counter and watched as people paid money for what she had made with her own hands, with her father's hammer, in the forge by the riverbank. She was silent. Her face was red. Her eyes were shining. Not from tears, from something else. By evening, Daniel had tallied the proceeds. 320 kroner in a single day. Not much by the Empire's standards. A fortune by Hedmark standards. But the money wasn't the main thing. Something else was. People were trading. People were talking to strangers. People saw that their labor had value. That Olaf's pot was worth 5 crowns. That Sona's knife was worth 3. That the canvas from the camp was worth 2 crowns per cubit. That they weren't trash discarded by the war. They were craftsmen. They were workers. They were people who had something to offer the world. The system reacted that night. The number of satisfied souls jumped from 520 to 780. 260 souls in a single day. 800 crowns in excess of revenue appeared in the treasury. Daniel sat by the chest and counted. 7,000 plus 320 plus 800. 8,120. Still a long way from 20,000. But the jump from 500 to 780 souls meant that the pace of revenue would increase. If the fair were held once a month, if the workshops increased production, if Sona set up a second anvil, if Olaf took on more apprentices. If. A lot of ifs. But for the first time, the numbers added up not to a loss, but to hope. Merchant Morgan was the last to leave. Before departing, he approached Daniel and said he'd heard many interesting things about the young Baron Hedmark, and that he now saw the rumors had been an understatement. He asked if there would be another fair. Daniel said, in a month. Morgan nodded and said he'd come, and bring friends. He left. Daniel stood at the crossroads and watched the last wagons drive away. The sun was setting. The awning cast a long shadow. Irene stood beside him, silently. Then she said it had been a good day. Daniel said yes. It had been. She paused and said that none of the merchants from Kalderna had heard of a boy named Run. Daniel looked at her. She was staring at the road. Her face was calm. Her back was straight. Her hands were at her sides. He said they would look for him. She nodded and walked toward the wagon. At the fair, Daniel didn't notice one person, a woman in a dark cloak who was standing at the edge of the awning and wasn't buying anything. She was watching the stalls, the people, and the Baron, who was speaking to every merchant by name. She left before sunset. Bjorn noticed her. He reported it that morning. He said the woman had arrived on horseback, alone, a fine horse, fine weapons. The sword at her belt wasn't just for show, a professional. Daniel took note and forgot about it. A week later she returned, not alone. She was with 5 others, 4 men and 1 woman, all armed, all on horseback. They set up camp at the eastern border of Hedmark, in the no-man's land between the province and the lands of Ulfgar. Bjorn brought Daniel to them on the 3rd day. She was standing by the fire, cleaning her sword. Of average height, lean and wiry, short red hair. Her face marked by fine scars. Her eyes were green and calm as those of someone who had seen so much blood that it no longer surprised her. She looked at Daniel and said her name was Ashley. She explained that she was the commander of a mercenary unit, 6 swordsmen, including herself, and that Baron Ulfgar Gronsk had hired them to escort his embassy to Hedmark. The embassy would arrive in 3 days. Daniel asked which embassy. Ashley said that Ulfgar was sending 5 horsemen and an official with a proposal. She didn't know exactly what it was. Her job was to guard them, not to think. Daniel asked why she was telling him this in advance. Ashley was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said she'd been at the fair.
She'd seen Baron Hedmark unloading a wagon of grain alongside his men with his own 2 hands. She'd seen him address the peasants by name. She'd seen an old woman bow to him, and he'd bowed back. She said that in 10 years as a mercenary, she had served 4 barons and 1 count. Not a single one of them knew the name of his own stable hand. But this one knows the name of every potter at his fair. Daniel was silent.
She said that Ulfgar's embassy would arrive with gifts, and with a provocation. That among the 5 horsemen, 2 are not diplomats, but fighters. That Ulfgar is counting on an incident, a brawl in the castle courtyard, a pretext for a complaint to the Imperial Chancellery, perhaps even a pretext for a raid. Daniel asked why she was telling him this. Ashley said that Ulfgar had paid her to escort them. Not for loyalty. A contract is a contract. She'll escort the embassy to the gates and then leave. What happens next is none of her business. But she thought the Baron should know in advance. Daniel looked her in the eyes. She didn't look away. He said thank you. She shrugged and went back to cleaning her sword. He rode off. Bjorn rode alongside him and remained silent all the way to the castle. Then he said that the mercenary was telling the truth, that he knew people like that if she'd warned him, it meant she had a stake in the matter, and if she had a stake in the matter, it meant she was already half Ulfgarian. Daniel said he thought so too. He spent 3 days preparing, not for battle, for a reception. He ordered the castle courtyard to be cleaned, the gates to be repaired, Hedmark's banner to be hung above the entrance. Greta prepared the best meal she was capable of. Venison, porridge, bread, beer. Not luxurious, but clean and filling. Irene prepared the documents, maps, lists, figures, everything that might be needed. Bjorn posted guards, 30 men, 23 of his own and 7 former refugee soldiers. Armed, sober, in position. The embassy arrived at noon. 5 horsemen, an official in a Gronsk-crested cloak, and Ashley with 5 mercenaries. She was the last to ride into the courtyard. She looked at Daniel. He gave a barely perceptible nod. She turned her horse around and led her detachment out through the gate. The contract was fulfilled. The embassy had been delivered. Ulfgar's official turned out to be a man in his 50s with a sycophantic smile and sweaty hands. His name was Kramer. He talked a lot. Politely. Sarcastically. He presenting gifts from Baron Gronska. A cask of wine, a piece of silk, a dagger with a silver hilt, and an offer. Ulfgar was ready to buy the eastern pastures from Hedmark for 5,000 crowns. Immediately. In cash. Daniel looked at the map. The eastern pastures. A third of the province's territory. The best lands. Meadows where herds had grazed just 10 years ago. 5,000 kron for land worth 30. He looked at Kramer. He thanked him for the generous offer. He said he needed time to think it over. Kramer smiled and said that time was a luxury not everyone had, and that the first payment to the crown seemed to be due very soon. Daniel smiled back. He invited the embassy to dinner. At the table, Kramer continued to apply pressure, subtly, between sips of wine. He talked about how Ulfgar was expanding its territories, how he now had 3 battle mages in his service, how the crown favored the old, loyal houses rather than the young upstarts who fed vagrants and opened schools for the rabble. 2 guards from the embassy sat at the end of the table and drank. A lot. Loudly. One of them shoved the guard Bjorn, who was standing by the door, accidentally, or perhaps not. Bjorn didn't move. He looked at Daniel. Daniel shook his head almost imperceptibly. Bjorn took a step back. The warrior laughed and said something about cowardly Hedmark dogs. Silence. Everyone froze. Here it was, the moment, the provocation. Daniel stood up, slowly. He raised his goblet, turned toward the fighter, and said he was glad the guests felt at home, that in Hedmark, guests aren't mistreated, even if they're ill-mannered, and that he asked everyone to drink to the health of Baron Gronska, who had sent such interesting people. He drank. Kramer drank. The fighters exchanged glances. There would be no fight. The provocation hadn't worked. Kramer left that evening, without a response to the proposal. Daniel said he would send a reply in a week. Kramer nodded. The smile didn't fade from his face, but his eyes had changed. They were hard. He realized that the young baron wasn't so simple. The delegation left. Bjorn approached Daniel and said he wanted to break that scoundrel's jaw. Daniel said he knew, and that was exactly why he hadn't done it. Bjorn asked what the Baron would say to Ulfgar's proposal. Daniel said he would refuse. Bjorn said that Ulfgar would get angry then. Daniel said that Ulfgar was already angry, ever since he found out that his peasants were buying knives from the Hedmark dwarf and asking why they didn't have a fair like that. Bjorn looked at him and smiled for the first time in 3 months. It was the crooked, brief smile of a professional soldier. He said the Baron needed more people. Daniel said he knew. In the morning, he found Ashley. Her unit was camped half a verst from the castle. She was sitting by the fire, eating an apple. He walked over and said he had a proposal. She said she was listening. He said he needed a captain for the provincial guard, that Bjorn commanded the castle guard, and he needed someone for the outer perimeter, the borders, the roads, the patrols. 6 swordsmen, plus whoever she could recruit and train. A salary of 20 crowns a month for each, housing, food, and the right to land after 2 years of service. Ashley stopped chewing. She looked at him and said nothing. Then she asked if he knew who she was. He said he knew she was a mercenary, that she'd been living under a false name for 10 years, that she was on the run from a blood feud, that she couldn't stay in one place for more than half a year. She tensed. Her hand rested on the hilt of her sword. He said he didn't care who she was. What mattered to him was who she would become, and that if she agreed, he would draw up a document for her in the name of Captain Ashley Headmark. With a seal, with a coat of arms, with the right to land, a new name, a new home, a clean slate. She was silent. For a long time. An apple lay in her hand, half eaten and forgotten. She said she'd think about it. He nodded and left. 3 days of silence. On the 4th day, Ashley entered the castle, sober, in clean clothes, with a sword at her belt. She approached Daniel, who at that moment was standing over a map with Irene and Halvar. She stood before him. She stood up straight. She said 2 words. My baron. Then she added that as long as she was alive, no one would leave this court with a weapon against him. Halvar looked at her. Then at Daniel. Then at her again. And he said quietly that she was interrupting their work. May was drawing to a close. There were 5 weeks left until the payment deadline. There were 11,000 crowns in the treasury. 20,000 were needed. Daniel counted every day, every night. The system yielded 120 to 150 crowns a day, 830 satisfied souls. Growth had slowed. Those who could become satisfied already had. The rest lived in distant villages where Daniel's influence hadn't yet reached. Or they didn't believe. Or they didn't know it was possible to live differently. He needed a breakthrough. The second fair took place in early May. More people, more goods. Olaf brought 120 pots. Sona displayed knives, horseshoes, and iron door hinges. The weavers brought not only plain cloth, but also their first dyed fabrics. Jonsa helped them. She knew herbs. She knew which root produced blue, which bark produced red, which lichen produced yellow. Colored fabrics cost 3 times as much as gray ones. The merchant Morgan arrived as promised. And he brought 2 friends with him. One traded in leather, the other in wool. The day's takings amounted to 600 kroner, but Daniel wasn't looking at the takings. He watched Morgan, who was walking between the stalls and talking to the artisans, who was feeling the fabrics and tapping on the pots, who was jotting something down in a small notebook. The merchant was calculating, evaluating, estimating. After the fair, Morgan approached Daniel and said he had a business proposal. Not here, at the castle, behind closed doors. Daniel invited him the next day. Morgan arrived in the morning. He sat down in the study. He accepted a mug of beer, took a sip, set it down, and said he wanted to invest in Headmark. Daniel didn't bat an eye. Morgan continued. He said he saw potential. Olaf's pots are better than what they make in the capital. Sona's knives are better than those from Groan. Dyed fabrics can be sold in any city in the empire, but Headmark lacks scale. Olaf is alone. Sona is alone. There are few weavers. They need to expand, and expansion requires money. He's ready to invest 5,000 kroner, on certain conditions. Daniel asked what they were. Morgan said he wanted the exclusive right to sell Headmark goods outside the province for 3 years, 20% of all revenue, and a place for his own warehouse on Headmark territory. Daniel listened. 5,000 crowns. That was the money that would bridge the gap. 11 plus 5 equals 16, plus whatever the system would provide for the remaining 5 weeks. That might be enough. But the conditions were harsh. Exclusive rights for 3 years meant that Headmark wouldn't be able to trade directly with other merchants. 20% was 1/5 of his total earnings, and a warehouse on provincial territory was like a stranger's eye in his own home. He looked at Morgan. The merchant sat calmly, smiling, waiting. Daniel said he needed a day. Morgan nodded and left. Daniel called a meeting. Halvar, Irene, Bjorn, Ashley, who in just 2 weeks of service had already managed to travel the entire border and map out the weak spots. He laid out Morgan's proposal. Halvar said that 5,000 kroner was a lifeline, that they should take it. Bjorn said that a stranger's warehouse on their own land was like a foreign garrison, only worse. Because a garrison is visible, but a warehouse isn't. Irene remained silent. Daniel looked at her and asked what she thought. She said the terms could be changed. Daniel raised an eyebrow. She said that exclusive rights for 3 years was too much. They could offer 2 years, with the option to extend if both sides were satisfied. 20% was too much. They could offer 15. And the warehouse. Let there be a warehouse, but not his. A shared one. A trading yard at the crossroads. Where Morgan stores his goods, and where other merchants can store theirs as well, for a fee, which goes to the Headmark treasury. Everyone looked at her. Halvar opened his mouth and closed it. Bjorn snorted. Ashley, who was sitting in the corner sharpening a knife, said that the girl was smarter than everyone in that room put together. Irene didn't react. Daniel said it was a good plan. The next day, he met with Morgan. He laid out the counterproposal. Morgan listened. His expression didn't change. He was a businessman. He'd seen negotiators like this before, but he'd never seen anyone so young. He haggled for 2 hours. Irene sat next to Daniel and slipped him notes with numbers. Every time Morgan named a figure, Irene wrote another one next to it, a more precise one, a more favorable one. Morgan noticed this. He looked at Irene and said that the Baron had a very good secretary. Irene didn't look up from her papers. The deal was closed 3 hours later. 2 years of exclusive rights, with the option to renew. 15% of revenue generated outside the province. A trading post at the intersection where Morgan would get space for a warehouse, but would pay rent. 5,000 crowns up front, in cash. Morgan shook Daniel's hand. Then he looked at Irene. Then back at Daniel. He said it was advice for the future. Don't let this girl go. Never. And he left. Irene sat at the table, rewriting the terms of the deal on a blank sheet of paper. Her hands didn't tremble. Her face was calm. Her back was straight. Daniel said she had saved the province 5% and the trading post. She said she had simply done the math. He said it was more than just math. She looked up. She looked at him. For 2 seconds. Then she looked away and continued writing. Morgan's money arrived the next day. 5,000 kroner in silver. In 3 bags. Halvar counted it twice. The treasury. 16,000. Up to 24. The system yielded 120 per day. 5 weeks is 35 days. 35 times 120 is 4,200. 16 plus 400 is 20,200. Just enough. But it's enough. If nothing happens. If the system doesn't collapse. If there are no expenses. If. He sat in his office at night, staring at the numbers. Irene had gone to bed long ago. Halvar, too. The castle was asleep. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere far away in the villages of Headmark, people were getting into beds that were a little warmer than yesterday's, eating porridge that was a little thicker, drinking water that was a little cleaner. Small steps, tiny ones, but each one counted. Each one turned into a silver coin in a chest, into a quiet hope that tomorrow would be no worse than today. Daniel closed his eyes. The system panel glowed with a soft blue light. 890 satisfied souls. He thought about how, just 2 months ago, there had been 0, and that 900 satisfied people were a quiet, invisible revolution. No one had stormed the Bastille. No one had overthrown a tyrant. It was simply that, for the first time in a year and a half, 900 people were going to bed without worrying that tomorrow might be worse. At the end of May, another letter arrived from Ovgar. Not through an official, through a horseman in black. The letter was brief. Ovgar wrote that the refusal to sell the eastern pastures had been noted, that he hoped the young baron knew what he was doing, and that in the fall he would pay a visit in person, not with an embassy, with his retinue, to discuss the borders. In person. Bjorn read the letter and said it wasn't an invitation to talk. It was a warning of war. Ashley read it and said Ovgar would bring 100 swordsmen, maybe 150, that 23 guards and 6 mercenaries were no match for that they needed to prepare. Daniel read the letter a third time. He put it down on the table and said there were 4 months until fall and that he wasn't going to win the war with swords. Ashley asked, "With what then?" Daniel said, "With people." She didn't understand. He said he'd explain later. Right now, there was something more important. The first installment to the crown. In 3.5 weeks. The first installment was paid 3 days before the deadline, 20,000 crowns. The silver, packed in sacks, was loaded onto 4 carts. Bjorn drove them himself, accompanied by 10 guards and Ashley with his squad. Daniel wanted to go himself. Irene said that if the Baron left for 2 weeks, Violet would write to her guardian that very evening. He stayed. He waited 12 days. On the 13th, Bjorn returned. He brought a receipt bearing the seal of the imperial treasury.
20,000 crowns had been received. The next installment was due in a year. Daniel took the receipt. He read it. He placed it on the table. He sat down. And he sat there for 5 minutes without moving. Then he quietly said one word. All right. Halvar was standing by the door. His eyes were shining. He said that in 40 years of service to the Hedmark estate, this was the first time he'd seen the Baron pay a debt on time. Daniel said this was only the first. There were still 100,000 owed to the crown and 80 to the merchants. Halvar nodded. But his expression had changed. It was bright. He believed. For the first time in a year and a half, the old steward believed that the province would survive. The news spread throughout Hedmark in 3 days. The Baron had paid the crown. Hedmark would not be sold. The land would remain. The people would remain. The system reacted that very night. The number of satisfied souls jumped from 920 to 1,100. 180 souls in a single night. Hope proved to be more powerful than porridge and a warm shelter. People believed they had a future. And that feeling was worth more than any silver. The summer was hot and short. Daniel worked like a machine. The 4th village was rebuilt. The 5th. Wells were repaired in 7 of the 8 surviving villages. The road from the castle to the crossroads was cleared and packed down. Gunter built a second workshop, a carpentry shop, 5 master craftsmen and 8 apprentices. Olaf expanded the pottery workshop, 3 potter's wheels, 6 apprentices. Pots were rolling off the line. Morgan took everything and asked for more. Sona forged more than just knives and nails. She began making plows, lightweight ones with sharp plowshares, better than those from before the war. She gave the first plow to Willem, the village elder from Lower Krog. Willem took it in his hands and was silent for a minute. Then he said that in his 60 years of life, this was the first time he'd held something made especially for him. Sona turned away and muttered that it was nothing special. Just a plow. Willem shook his head and went off to plow. In July, Daniel opened what he called the warm room next to the castle kitchen. It was a large space, long tables, benches, a hearth. Every day, from morning till night, there were pots of porridge and kettles of boiling water there. Anyone could come in and eat. Orphans, widows, the elderly, those who couldn't work, those with nowhere else to go. Daniel didn't make a big announcement about it. He simply opened the doors. Within a week, 40 people a day were having lunch in the warm room. Within a month, 70. Greta grumbled that they'd never have enough flour to feed them all. Daniel showed her the numbers. Each bowl of porridge cost the treasury 3 copper groschen. Every satisfied person brought the system anywhere from 5 groschen to a silver krone. The math was simple. Greta looked at the numbers and said the Baron was good at math. He said no, it was profitable. Greta snorted. But she no longer begrudged the flour. In August, what Daniel had been waiting for and dreading happened. He needed a hospital. Not Dr. Fergus, who treated patients with prayers and poultices. Real help. He'd been thinking about it from day one, ever since he saw children dying from dirty water. But a hospital needed a doctor, and there was no doctor in Hedmark. There was Jansa. She arrived in Hedmark in late spring, quietly. No announcements. She just showed up at the fair. Small, quick, dark hair tied back in a ponytail, hands stained green from herbs. She was buying salt. Halvar said she was an herbalist, that she traveled through the villages with her grandmother, that her grandmother had died a month ago, that the girl was now alone. Daniel found her on the 3rd day. She was sitting on the banks of the Solven, drying bandages on the rocks. He walked over. She looked up. Her eyes were dark and lively. He asked why she boiled the bandages before drying them. She said her grandmother had taught her, that if you don't boil a bandage, the wound will fester. She doesn't know why, but it works. Daniel sat down next to her. He said he knew why. That creatures so small they're invisible to the naked eye live in a dirty bandage. That they get into the wound and cause it to rot. That boiling water kills them. Jansa looked at him. Her mouth fell open. She asked how he knew that. He said he'd read it. She asked where one could read about such things. He said he'd show her. She asked 14 more questions over the next 10 minutes, without pause, without politeness. Like someone who'd wanted to ask all her life but had no one to ask. He asked her to stay in Hedmark, at least for a week, to show him how she boiled the bandages. She stayed for a week, then for a month, then forever. In September, Daniel ordered a medical reference book through the system. It cost 500 shower points. He had 1,100. He ordered it. A thick, leather-bound book appeared on the table. The text was in Korean. He sat down with Yansu and began translating, chapter by chapter. Antiseptics, dressings, obstetric care, wound care, simple surgical procedures. Yansu listened and took notes. She wrote faster than he spoke. Her notebook had doubled in size over the course of a month. She asked questions on every page. She didn't take anything at face value. She double-checked everything. She boiled bandages for different lengths of time and compared the results. She mixed solutions and tested them on scratches. She took each patient's pulse and recorded the numbers. She was a scientist. She just didn't know it. At the end of September, Daniel set aside a house next to the castle wall for the hospital. Small, stone, 8 beds, 1 room for Yansu, a storeroom for herbs and bandages. He insisted that her name be hung above the door. Yansu said it was silly, that she wasn't a real doctor, that she was just a herbalist. He said that in a year she'd be the best doctor in the province. She said he was crazy, but she hung up the sign. In October, a woman was brought in from a distant village. She was pregnant. Labor had started early. The village healer said both mother and child would die. Her husband put his wife on a cart and drove her to Hedmark, a 2-day journey. Yansu took her in. Labor lasted all night. Daniel waited on the steps, not because he had to, because he couldn't leave. Toward morning, a cry rang out from the little hospital. A baby's cry, high-pitched, lively, then silence, then a second cry. Yansu stepped out onto the porch. Her hands were covered in blood up to her elbows. Her face was pale. Her eyes were wide. She said the mother was alive, and the baby was alive. A boy, healthy. Daniel nodded. Yansu sat down next to him on the steps. She was silent for a minute. Then she said quietly that she thought she'd found the courage to believe in herself, and that it was his fault. He didn't answer. They sat on the steps and watched the sun rise over Hedmark. The system flashed. 1,300 satisfied souls. Fall brought 3 things: the harvest, hope, and Olvgar. The harvest turned out to be modest but viable. Barley grew in the southern fields, rye in the western ones. The oats didn't take, they'd been sown too late. But 2 out of 3 is better than 0 out of 3. The peasants gathered the grain and, for the first time in 2 years, carried it not to a stranger's granary, but to their own, into Olaf's pots, which were free from mouse bites and kept out the damp. Willem from Lower Krog arrived at the castle with 2 sacks of barley. He set them down at the gate and said they were the tithe, a tax for the baron. Daniel looked at the sacks, then at Willem. He said there would be no tithe this year. Willem didn't understand. Daniel said this was the first harvest since the war, that the grain was needed more in the village than at the castle, that he would collect the tithe from the next harvest, when the land had recovered. Willem stood there in silence. Then he walked up to Daniel, close. He looked up at him, old, wrinkled, with hands that had plowed this land for 60 years. He said that Daniel's father had been a good man, but he had never spoken such words before. He turned around and rode away. Irene stood nearby. She said that if the tithe were abolished, the treasury would lose 300 crowns. Daniel said that the treasury would lose 300, but the system would gain 1,000, because people who see that the baron believes in them believe in the baron. Irene was silent for a moment. Then she said that his math was strange again. He said it had always worked. Irene almost smiled. Hope came from where they least expected it. In early October, a woman arrived in Hedmark on a black horse, alone, without an escort, wearing a hooded traveling cloak. She dismounted at the castle gates and asked to see the baron. She introduced herself as Clarence Ashgrove. Irene turned pale. She whispered to Daniel that the Ashgroves were the family of the imperial treasurer. If the treasurer's daughter had come in person, she said, it was either very good or very bad. Daniel received her in his office. Clarence Ashgrove turned out to be a 25-year-old woman, slender, dark hair, cold, light-colored eyes, impeccable posture, impeccable speech, an impeccable gaze that assessed everything and gave nothing away. She said she had come on behalf of the Imperial Chancellery, as an observer. Hedmark Province had made its first debt payment on time, and this had raised questions. 4 months ago, the province was bankrupt. Now it's paying in silver. Where did the money come from? Is there embezzlement? Is there heresy? Is there treason? It was her job to find out. Daniel listened. He looked at Clarence and saw what she was hiding behind her impeccable facade. Dark circles under her eyes from 4 hours of sleep. Fingers that mechanically clenched into fists and unclenched. The habit of keeping her back so straight it caused pain. Her father's tool, perfectly honed and sent out to carry out the mission. He didn't play games with her. He didn't try to be cunning. He didn't hide anything. He said he would show her everything. All the accounting records, all the entries, all the expenses, all the income, every krona, every penny. She could check as much as she wanted. For a second, Clarence was taken aback. She'd expected resistance, excuses, attempts to bribe her.
Instead, she was presented with an open door. He called for Irene. He said that Miss Ashgrove needed to be given full access to all of the province's documentation, including the errors. Irene looked at him, then at Clarence. She nodded and led the guest to the archives. Clarence worked for 3 weeks, silently, methodically. She sat in the archives for 12 hours at a time. She read every document. She cross-checked every number. She asked Irene questions, short, precise ones. Irene answered, briefly, precisely. 2 like-minded minds worked side by side in silence. On the 5th day, Clarence asked Daniel to explain one thing: where the 412 silver crowns had come from on the first night. The documents show a deposit. No source, no payer's name, just money. Daniel was silent for 10 seconds. Then he told the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough. He said he had an ability, a gift. The province brings him income proportional to the well-being of its residents. The happier the people are, the more coins appear in the treasury. He can't explain the mechanism, but he can show the result. Every coin in the treasury has a physical weight and a specific silver fineness. He doesn't counterfeit money. He doesn't steal. He doesn't practice magic in the traditional sense. He simply cares for the people and is paid for it. Clarence looked at him for a long time. Then she said it sounded like heresy. He said heresy is when you do harm. He doesn't do harm. He builds. She can write whatever she wants in her report, but first, let her see the province with her own eyes. She looked. He drove her around for 2 weeks, through the villages, through the workshops, to the fair, to the school in Mayrid, where there were now 26 children instead of 12, to the little hospital in Yonso, to Sona's blacksmith shop, where the water hammer pounded non-stop, to the warm room where the elderly ate porridge and talked for the first time in years. Clarence watched. She took notes. She remained silent. On the 14th day, she returned to the office. She sat down at the desk. She laid out the papers, and she asked Daniel if she could help him get his reports to the Crown in order, because his bookkeeping was flawless in substance, but a mess in form. And if he submitted the report as is, the Treasury would tear him apart. Daniel looked at her. For the first time in 3 weeks, she was looking him in the eye, not as an observer, but as a person. He said he would be grateful. She worked for another month. She rewrote all the financial reports, bringing them into a format that any imperial official could understand. She found 3 errors that could have cost Hedmark a fine and corrected them. She drafted a petition for partial debt relief, arguing that the province had suffered from the war and was rebuilding without imperial aid, and was therefore entitled to relief under paragraph 16 of the Imperial Code. Daniel read the petition and couldn't believe it. Paragraph 16 actually existed. It granted the right to write off up to 30% of the debt for provinces affected by military operations. No one had ever used it because no one knew about it, except for the daughter of the imperial treasurer. She wrote a report to the capital, an honest one. The province is not heretical, not rebellious, exemplary. Recommendation, to forgive part of the debt. She signed it, dated it, and affixed the seal she brought with her, the seal of the Crown's observer. Then she folded the papers. She looked at Daniel and said her father would be furious. Daniel asked why. She said it was because, for the first time in her life, she'd written the truth, not what she'd been told to write. She said this calmly, without drama, but her hands on the table clenched into fists. Daniel said nothing. He just nodded. She left the next day. She stopped at the castle gates. She turned around. She said she'd be back. He said the doors were open. That night, the system recorded 1,500 satisfied souls. Ovgar arrived at the end of October, not with a diplomatic mission, with a retinue. 120 horsemen, heavy cavalry, 3 battle mages in the rear ranks. They set up camp on the eastern border of Hedmark and waited. Bjorn rode up to the castle at dawn. His horse was covered in foam. His face was pale. He said they had 30 guards and 6 of Ashley's mercenaries, against 120. This isn't a battle. It's a massacre. Daniel listened. He rose from the table. He walked to the window. He looked out at the courtyard where Mayrid was leading the children to their morning lesson, where Olaf was carrying a basket of clay to the potter's workshop, where Greta was hanging out the laundry. An ordinary morning.
An ordinary life. One that 120 horsemen could wipe out in a single day. He turned to Bjorn and said he needed a week. Bjorn said Ulfgar would give him 3 days. Daniel said that meant he'd have to get it done in 3. He didn't gather an army. He mounted his horse and rode off, alone, without a guard. Irene said it was madness.
He said he'd take Ashley. Irene said Ashley was 6 swords, not an army. He said he didn't need an army. He needed 3 days and 12 villages. He rode off. Ashley rode alongside him and said nothing. The first village, Lower Krog. Willem came out to the gate. Daniel dismounted. He said that Ulfgar was stationed at the border with 120 swords, that he had come for the lands of Hedmark, that if he got through, the villages would be the first to burn. Just like a year and a half ago. Willem listened. His face was ashen. His hands were clenched. He remembered the Rotten War. Everyone in Hedmark remembered it. Daniel said he wasn't asking them to fight. He wasn't asking them to die. He was asking for just one thing. Willem asked what? Daniel took out a map. He pointed it out. Between Hedmark and Ulfgar's lands lay 3 mountain passes, mountain trails through wooded hills. Heavy cavalry can only pass through them. There's nowhere else to go. If the passes are blocked, Ulfgar's army is stuck in place. Willem asked how to block a pass. Daniel said it was enough to block the trail with trees. 10 men with axes could block any passage in half a day so that cavalry couldn't get through. Willem was silent. Then he said that this wasn't war, it was just logging. Daniel said that was exactly right. Willem said his men knew how to cut down trees. Daniel nodded. They visited 12 villages in 2 days. Daniel spoke with each village head personally. He didn't give orders. He asked. He explained. He showed them a map. He called each one by name. He asked about their families, about their children, about the harvest. Then he spoke about Ulfgar, about the 120 swords, about what would happen if they got through, and about what needed to be done to stop them from getting through. 11 village elders agreed. The 12th said he was afraid. His village was closest to Ulfgar's border. If Baron Gronsk found out that his people had blocked the pass, he would burn them first. Daniel looked at him. The village elder's name was Eric, 65 years old, 3 grandchildren. He was afraid for them. Daniel didn't try to persuade him. He said he understood, that he wasn't asking them to put their children at risk, and that Eric's village could simply do nothing. The others would manage. Eric stared at the ground. Then he said quietly that the young baron had repaired their well in the winter, that he'd given them seeds in the spring, that he'd waived the tithe in the summer, that his granddaughter was attending school in Mayrid for the first time in her life. For the first time in her life. He paused. Then he said his men would set out at dawn. By the 3rd day, all 3 mountain passes had been blocked. 100-year-old fir trees lay across the trails in 3 layers. Rocks lay between them, branches, frozen ground. Cavalry won't get through. Infantry might, but it would take the infantry days to clear the way. And all that time, they'd be stuck in narrow passages where 30 archers on the hillsides face hundreds of swords below. Ulfgar found out the next day. His scouts returned and reported that the passes were blocked, all 3, that the peasants had blocked them. Not soldiers, not mercenaries, peasants with axes, voluntarily. Ulfgar didn't believe it. He sent out a second scouting party. They returned with the same answer, and they added something else. 3 villages right on Ulfgar's border, his own. They too had blocked their own paths. From the Hedmark side, his own peasants had blocked the path of his own army, because they didn't want war, because they'd bought Sona's knives at the fair, because they'd heard that in Hedmark the elderly were fed for free, because one of them had taken his daughter to Yongtse and she'd cured the child of a fever, because they were comparing. Their own baron, who took everything they had left, and the stranger, who gave them the first thing he had. Ulfgar stood in his camp and looked at the blocked mountain passes. His mages could clear the trails in a day, but that would mean war with the peasants, with his own peasants. Imperial law forbade barons from killing their subjects without a trial, and if he killed the Hedmarkers, the crown would have a pretext to confiscate his lands. A trap, a silent one, without a single sword, without a single arrow, a trap made of fallen trees and human choice. 3 days later, Ulfgar broke camp and left, in silence, without a letter, without threats. He hadn't lost a battle, he'd lost the idea. Bjorn stood on the hill and watched as Ulfgar's column marched eastward. Then he turned to Daniel and said that in 20 years of service, he'd never seen a war won with axes and wells. Daniel said he hadn't won the war. He'd bought time. Ulfgar will return. Bjorn nodded, but he smiled, that same crooked, brief smile. That evening, Daniel returned to the castle. They were waiting for him in the courtyard. Halvar, Irene, Sona, Meirid, Jonsa, Greta, Gunther, Olaf, Bjorn, and Ashley. And another 200 people. Refugees, artisans, peasants from nearby villages. They stood in silence. He walked among them toward the porch. No one shouted. No one bowed. They simply stood and watched. The man who had protected them without a sword. The system flashed. 2,400 satisfied souls. Winter had fallen on Hedmark, the second since Daniel had opened his eyes in a foreign body. But this winter was different. Stoves were burning in the houses. Hedmark stoves with double chambers, which Sona had forged according to a blueprint from the system, now stood in every restored village. They used half as much firewood. There was twice as much heat. People weren't freezing. The second year began with Daniel doing one thing he'd been putting off for half a year. He created a registry of refugees. Not the list of names that Irene had compiled during the first month. A real registry. With descriptions of their appearances, with the place each person came from, with the names of those they were looking for. He sent copies to all the rebuilt villages, to all the fairs, to every Morgan caravan passing through the province. Irene didn't know about this. She found out in the 8th month, when Halvar walked into the office and placed a letter from a village on the northern border in front of her. The letter stated that a 10-year-old boy was living with farmer Thorgir's family. He had been found in the forest 2 years ago. He doesn't remember his own name, but he remembers his sister's name. Irene. Irene read the letter. Her expression didn't change. She placed the letter on the table, straight, neatly. She smoothed out the crease. Then she stood up and left. Daniel found her an hour later. She was standing by the castle wall looking north. Her back was straight. Her arms were at her sides. She wasn't crying. She wasn't moving. He walked over and stood beside her, in silence. She didn't turn around. She quietly asked how he knew to search the registry. He said it was standard procedure, in his world. She asked what he meant by, in his world. He didn't answer. She didn't press him. They traveled after run for 3 days. Irene didn't sleep a single night. Daniel could tell by the dark circles under her eyes, but he didn't say anything. When they arrived at the village, the boy was standing by the fence, small, skinny, with dark eyes like Irene's. He looked at them, but didn't recognize them. Irene dismounted. She approached slowly. She crouched down. The boy took a step back. She didn't move. She simply said his name. Run. The boy blinked, then again. Then his face broke, and he rushed toward her. She caught him, held him close. She didn't cry. She held him, tightly. As if she let go, he would disappear again. Daniel turned away. He walked over to the wagon. He stood there and stared at the horizon until his eyes stopped being wet. That night at Iron Castle, she sat in the study. Rune was sleeping in the next room. She was sitting on the floor by the wall. Daniel came in to check the documents and found her there. She looked up. She looked at him. She reached out and silently took him by the sleeve. Not by the hand, by the sleeve. Her slender fingers clasped the fabric. She sat like that until dawn. He didn't leave. Spring of the second year was different. Not about survival, about building. 6 villages have been fully restored. 2 workshops are operating at full capacity. Olaf's pottery workshop produces 200 pots a month. Sona's blacksmith shop makes plows and tools. The weavers dye fabrics with herbs from Jonsa. Morgan comes every month and takes away full carts. The trading post at the crossroads was always bustling. The monthly fair drew people from 3 neighboring provinces. Daniel ordered a blueprint for a glassmaking furnace through the system. It cost 800 points. He had 2,600. The glass workshop opened by summer. The first window made of Hedmark glass was installed in Meirid's school. The children stood and looked out at the street through the clear glass. For some, it was the first time in their lives they'd seen glass. Meirid stood by the wall and watched them. That evening, for the first time in a long while, she said a prayer. Not to herself, out loud, for the children, quietly, simply, as if she had remembered words she had long forgotten. Daniel stood by the door and listened. That summer, he began building a water system, a simple one. Wooden pipes made from hollowed-out logs, from the spring on the hill, down the slope to the central square of the new town. A town, not a village. Hedmark was no longer a village.
Houses lined 2 streets, a square in the center, a well, a market, a school, a hospital, a blacksmith shop, a potter's workshop, a glass workshop, a carpenter's shop, a weaver's workshop, 2 taverns that had opened on their own without his involvement. The water system had started working in August. Water flowed from a wooden trough in the square, and the women no longer had to walk to the river with buckets.
They stood around the trough and watched the water flow. Just flowing. Clean. Cold. All on its own. One of them began to cry. That day, the system recorded 2,900 satisfied souls. Daniel sat on the castle steps that evening. Irene sat beside him. Run was playing in the courtyard with the other children. She looked at her brother, and for the first time ever, her face was calm. Not tense, not forced. Just calm. Like water in a lake when there's no wind. She said quietly that when she came to this castle, she thought she would die here. That she would find her brother's body and lie down beside him. That there would be nothing left. Daniel was silent. She said she'd been wrong. He turned toward her. She wasn't looking at him, at Run, but her hand lay next to his. Close. Without touching, but close. In the fall, Daniel was summoned to the capital, not as a petitioner, as a guest. The letter arrived via an imperial courier. The Council of Peers wishes to see Baron Hedmark to discuss the state of the northern provinces. Clarence wrote separately, briefly. Her report had been accepted. Hedmark's debt had been reduced by 30%. But there were people who were unhappy with this. She recommended that he come and make a good impression. Daniel set out, with Irene, with Bjorn, with 10 guards. The capital greeted him with noise and splendor, a huge city, stone walls, wide streets, temples, palaces, markets selling things he hadn't seen in 2 years, silk, spices, wine, magical lamps. He walked down the street and thought that 2 years ago he had been counting sacks of flour and rejoicing over every hard-boiled egg. At the Council of Peers, he stood before 20 barons and 3 dukes, old, stern faces, coats of arms on the walls, gold on their garments. He was asked to explain how he had rebuilt the province. He told them, simply, without fanfare, porridge for the refugees, boiled water, canopies made of poles, wells, workshops, a school, a hospital, a fair, a water system, specific names, specific numbers. 12 children in school, now 52. 8 hospital beds, now 16. 0 workshops, now 7. The hall fell silent. One of the dukes asked how much it cost in monetary terms. Daniel named a figure. The duke asked again. Daniel repeated it. The duke said it was less than what he spent on his stables. Daniel didn't answer. Clarence was sitting in the back row. She nodded almost imperceptibly. In the lobby, a man approached him, tall, gray-haired, with eyes that looked through people rather than at them. He introduced himself. The first magister of the Imperial College of Mages. He said he was impressed, that the young baron was doing interesting things in the north, and that he would be happy to discuss the future of Hedmark, in person, at a convenient time. He smiled. The smile was warm. His eyes were cold. Daniel looked at him and felt a prick, not in his heart, at the back of his neck, like a cold finger. The system flashed a warning, red, for the first time ever. He didn't show it. He smiled back, said he'd be happy to. He walked away. Found Irene in the hallway. She was standing by the window looking out at the city. He said quietly that he'd found his enemy. Daniel returned from the capital at the beginning of winter in the 3rd year. The journey took a week. He remained silent the entire way. Irene rode beside him and asked no questions. She knew when he needed silence. In the capital, he had learned the truth, not from the first magister, but from Clarence. She had come to see him on the last evening before his departure. She closed the door, she sat down, and she told him what she had been piecing together over the past 3 months from the archives of the Imperial Chancellery. The Rotten War, which had lasted a year and a half and destroyed Hedmark, was no accident. The mercenary army of the neighboring duchy had not been paid for by the Duke. The money had flowed through 3 front trading houses. All 3 belonged to one man, the first magister of the College of Mages. His name was Varin Soulcraft, 72 years old, 40 years at the head of the college, the most powerful mage in the empire, and the man who knew what no one else knew. Beneath the northern hills of Hedmark, in old dwarven mines, lies ore. Not iron, not silver, not gold. Ore from which weapons capable of killing battle mages are forged, the only kind in the empire, perhaps the only kind in the world. 3 people knew about this ore. An old dwarf elder who discovered it and died 50 years ago, Daniel's father, to whom the elder confided before his death, and Varin Soulcraft, who learned of it through a spy. Daniel's father kept silent. He understood that if the Empire found out about the ore, Hedmark would turn into a battlefield. Every baron, every duke, every mage would want this ore. He remained silent and kept the secret. Varin Soulcraft wanted the ore for himself, not for the Empire, for himself. A weapon that kills mages in the hands of the Empire's chief mage is absolute power. No one could challenge his decisions if he possessed something capable of destroying any rival. He had paid for the Rotten War so that Hedmark would be ruined, so that the Baron would die in disgrace or be killed, so that the province would go under the hammer, so that, through frontmen, he could buy the land above the mines. Everything went according to plan. The Baron died. The province went bankrupt. The neighbors were waiting for the auction, and then an 18-year-old boy woke up at the table and started stirring the pot. Clarence said that Varin Soulcraft hasn't abandoned the plan yet, that he's quietly working in the capital. She's whispering to the crown that the young Baron Hedmark is too popular, that his methods are suspicious, that the peasants adore him, and that's dangerous for public order. That people like him need to be stopped before it's too late. Daniel listened. Then he asked what Clarence was proposing. She said she had documents, financial trails, 3 front trading houses and their connection to Soulcraft. Not enough for an indictment, but enough to raise suspicion, if presented to the right people. Daniel asked which people. Clarence said Princess Seyon, the Emperor's youngest daughter, who had been taking an interest in what was happening in Hedmark for the past 6 months, who had secretly sent people to observe his workshops and schools, who, at the last Council of Peers, had voted to lower taxes for the provinces undergoing reconstruction. Daniel returned to Hedmark armed with this knowledge, and with a plan. Not a military one, not a political one, a human one. He descended into the mines, for the first time, with Sona, who knew the dwarven tunnels better than anyone, with Bjorn for protection, with Irene, who recorded every step. The descent took half a day. Old tunnels. Stone walls marked by the chisels of the dwarves. The smell of dampness and iron. Darkness that no torch could pierce beyond 10 steps. They went down. Deeper. Deeper. And they found it. A vein of ore in the tunnel wall. Dark. Almost black. With a reddish glint in the firelight. Sona touched it with her fingers. She froze. Then she said quietly that her father had told her about this metal. That the dwarves called it silent iron. That a blade made of it doesn't ring out when it strikes. That it absorbs magic the way the earth absorbs water. Daniel stood in the tunnel and thought. Ore that kills mages. In Verena Soulcraft's hands, it is absolute power. In Daniel's hands, it's a shield. Protection that no spell can pierce. Not a sword, a shield. He told Sanya he needed 10 blades. She asked why. He said he'd explain later. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said she'd make 20. Just in case. They emerged from the mines by evening. At the entrance to the tunnel, Daniel stopped. He heard something. Not with his ears. Inside. A very quiet voice, like a whisper on the edge of sleep. The voice said one sentence. You've done this before. You just don't remember how many times. Keep going. He stood there, hearing those words, unable to explain where they came from. From the stone, from the air, from the earth beneath his feet. From something very old that had lain here long before the dwarves and humans and empires. He wasn't afraid. He felt warmth, as if someone had placed a hand on his shoulder and told him he wasn't alone, that he had never been alone, that every time he cooked porridge for other people's children, repaired a well for a stranger's village, and built a school for other people's orphans, he was doing what he was meant to do. Not in this life, not in the last. Always. He emerged from the tunnel. The sun was setting. The sky was red. Irene was standing at the entrance, waiting. He looked at her and said everything was fine. She nodded. She didn't believe him, but she didn't ask any questions. Winter passed in preparation. Sona forged blades from silent iron, quietly, during the night shift. No one but her inner circle knew. Clarence worked in the capital. She gathered documents. She was building a network of people who owed her a debt or trusted her. Irene corresponded with 3 provinces that were secretly emulating the Hedmark model. Schools, hospitals, workshops, fairs. They couldn't replicate the system, but they could replicate the principle. Care as a calculation, a person as a resource, not an expense. In the spring of the 3rd year, Princess Sehyan arrived in Hedmark, in person, with a small entourage. She spent 10 days in the province. She visited the workshops. She sat in on a class at Mayrid School. She visited the Yonso Clinic.
She stood by Sona's water hammer and watched the hammer fall. She drank beer at the fair with Ashley. She went over the numbers with Irene. She spoke with the peasants, calling them by name, because Daniel had introduced each one.
She left without a word. A month later, an imperial decree arrived. First Magister Varen Soulcraft had been suspended from office, pending an investigation, on suspicion of financial irregularities related to military operations in the Northern Territories. Clarence's documents had done their job, not as an accusation, as grounds for suspicion. Enough for the Crown to start asking questions. Enough for Soulcraft to lose access to the levers of power. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't convicted. But he was stopped. Daniel was offered a count's title, a move to the capital, a place at court, the position of advisor on provincial reconstruction. He refused. He wrote a polite letter. He thanked them for the honor, and explained that his place was in Hedmark, that he was needed here, that his people were here. Bjorn delivered the letter, in person. He returned 2 weeks later with a reply. Princess Sejong conveyed that she respected his choice, and that the crown was forgiving Hedmark's remaining debt, in full, for his service to the empire. Halvar read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down in a chair. Then he stood up. Then he sat down again. Then he said quietly that he needed a drink. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel said he'd join him. The two of them drank together in the study. Halvar drank in silence. Then he set down his goblet. He looked at Daniel and said that his father would be proud. Daniel didn't reply. He clutched his goblet. He looked out the window. Snow was falling outside the window. The 3rd winter. But this time, a stove was burning in every house. Every house had grain. In every house, someone was alive who might not have been. He thought of his mom, of the phone that wasn't there, of the call that wouldn't come, and he thought that maybe, someday, there are things that don't require a phone. There are things that are simply felt across any distance, through any wall, across any world. His mother would understand, even without a call. He set down his mug and stepped out onto the balcony. The square in front of the castle was packed. People had gathered, not on orders, on their own. The news of the debt forgiveness had spread in a single day. They were standing below. 8,000 people. 8,000. 2 years ago, there had been 3,400, and they were all hungry and frightened. Now there were 8,000. People had come to Hedmark, from neighboring provinces, from distant villages, from cities, because here they were fed, treated, educated, because here every person was not just a mouth to feed, but a pair of hands, not an expense, but a resource. Not a peasant, but a person with a name. They stood in the square and looked up. Irene stood next to Daniel, to his right. Rune was holding her hand. Halvar stood to his left. He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder, heavy, old, warm, the very gesture her father had never had time to make. Sona stood slightly behind them, for the first time in a dress instead of a work apron. Mayrid held the hand of the youngest of her students. Yonso stood next to Bjorn and Ashley. Ashley kept her hand on her sword. Not because she expected danger, out of habit. Clarence stood in the balcony doorway, quiet, unnoticed, as always, but she was there. Greta wiped her eyes with her apron and grumbled that there was no need to stand out in the cold. Olaf stood in the crowd in the square, with his students. Next to him was Gunther, with one hand and a broad smile. Next to him was Willem from Lower Krog. Next to him was Eric, whose granddaughter now attended school. Next to him was Tormund. Next to him was the old woman who had once brought him a hard-boiled egg. 8,000 faces. He knew every one of them. Not all by name, but every single one. The system flashed, gently, quietly. For the first time ever, it displayed not a number, but a phrase. Hedmark is no longer a cursed land. Onward. He stood on the balcony and looked out at the square. Snow was falling on people's faces, on the roofs of the houses, on the spire of Mayrid School, on the chimney of Yonso Hospital, on the roof of Sona's smithy, on the fairgrounds canopy, on the water pipe, on the castle walls, on the ground that had been dead 2 years ago. Iron stood beside him, close. Her hand touched his hand. Not her sleeve, his hand. Her slender fingers rested on his palm. He didn't pull away. She didn't pull away. They stood there, looking down, at the city they had built. And far to the north, beyond the hills, deep within the earth, a low rumble sounded. Quiet, barely audible. Something very old was opening its eyes. And perhaps